Hello, guys, and welcome to a little bit of a different, what do you want to call it? A different video. Sorry if you see me looking like a little bit over that way. That's because OBS is right behind it, and I'm checking that to see if everything works properly. But yeah, I thought I would make a little bit of a different video. Usually, I don't share my face on my gameplay videos. But I feel like in a video like this, where I kind of want to explain myself and kind of explain my thoughts on a subject like FSR 3 and DLSS 3, like frame generation, I thought it would be a great idea to actually share my thoughts on it and kind of tell you guys what I think DLSS 3 and FSR 3 should be, and kind of how I wish they would have developed it, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, let me just get straight into it. So first of all, DLSS 3 and FSR 3, what are those? Well, they are essentially the technologies made by different corporations, AMD and NVIDIA. They insert fake frames one-to-one in games that you have developed the generation technology for, or that you have inserted into the game. Now, I'm not a professional in the subject, okay? I only have an idea of how it works. I don't actually know the details of how it works. Although I do know how I would love for it to work, but that's wholly different. And I'm not talking about DLSS upscaling and FSR upscaling. Those are different things. I'm talking exclusively on the frame generation thing. Now, FSR 3 has recently come out and, been fixed, I guess I should say. And it's pretty okay, like, for what it is. But you see, the problem with those technologies is that while they insert fake frames between the real frames, it essentially doubles your FPS, right? But what if you have a frame rate limiter? What if you want a specific amount of frames? You're just forced to kind of suck it up, because you have to scale them one-to-one. It doesn't work properly if you insert a frame rate limiter. Now, before you yell at me and say, that's not true, that can't be the case, it's important to mention that I recently downloaded a mod for FSR 3, and I know it's a mod, but that's also how DLSS 3 works, where if you do set a frame rate limit, it goes ahead and takes half of that frame rate limit that you've set, and upscales from, as an example, I set 120 on all of my videos, because that scales one-to-one with 60, which I record my videos at. So I was like, alright, I'm gonna set my frame rate to 120, and then I'm gonna record 120 frames. That way I can scale down to 60 frames. So when I translate it to YouTube and stuff like that, it makes sense. Oh, I need to say, by the way, this video in the background and this music it's not owned by me. I'm not gonna monetize this video because of that, because this is other people's content. I'm not gonna earn money off of that. So this video should be ad-free. If it's not, I made a mistake. That's just all I'm saying. That I made a mistake. Oh yeah, and by the way, sorry about the full beard here. I'm gonna get rid of it soon. It makes me look older than I am. By the way, I'm 23. Just so you guys are aware. I'm not 40, even though I look a little bit like 40-year-old with this shirt and like my beard. Don't worry, if I get rid of my beard, I look like a little baby. But that's beside the point. But yeah, we're talking about FSR 3 and DLSS 3 and what I want those technologies to be. So yeah, I already explained a bit of what they aren't and what they can't do. But let me explain to you how I kind of want them to act. Like the whole frame rate thing, where it halves the frame rate because you put a limit on the frame rate, is kind of not what gamers want, if that makes sense. Like I know if you're a gamer and you want that, of course that's fine. Like I'm not saying you're wrong, or that most gamers might not want this, but let's just go with I instead, because I don't want to speak for people I don't know, and that's a bit rude, and some people might disagree. So I'm gonna go with what I want as a gamer myself, who plays a ton of games, who also records games. I want a way to set the FPS to essentially be a specific FPS all the time. So let's say you have an FPS of 100, right? And you want an FPS of 120. Well, why not use upscaling for that? Why not use frame generation for that? Why not say you want the frame generation to go to 120 and then insert frames between the other frames in order to then get 120 frames? The issues. Okay, the issues with frame generation itself, right, is that it gives latency based on the amount of frames it always gives you. And if you're going for lower frame rates, like let's say you limit your FPS to 120 because you want 120 FPS all the time, and your screen refresh rate is 120 or 144 or something like that, and enable frame generation, you're going to be above the limit now, and now you're going to have to use VSync or another kind of thing to stop the frame rate, and you still don't get the advantage of the fake frames, because now the frames are still limiting themselves to half of what you can actually see. That means that if you have 144 frames, you get half of 144 that it bases off of, and that hurts both, one, image quality, because it's still half the frames being, interpolated or whatever you want to call it. And at the same time, it also gives you a lot of input latency. Because let's say, again, 144. How much is that? Something 70, I guess. 72. I don't know. I'm not good at quick maths. Okay, that's my weak point. It was something like that, right? And you could have essentially gotten input latency higher, like gotten a lower latency, is what I should say, from simply just getting a higher base frame rate, and then upscaling to 144 from that frame rate. Not upscale. I keep saying upscale. I mean generating frames to 144 from that one. Now I get that there are limitations in the tech, right? You want it to be 1-to-1 because otherwise it could be unstable and it could not do things the way you might want. But I think we are so close now to how technology and AI works in that regard that I think they could try to aim a little bit higher. I think they could try to specifically add frames that are needed instead of frames that are forced, if that makes sense. Okay, so what is the meat of what I'm trying to say then? Because now I'm kind of talking of things without showing them off and stuff, but because I can't, because it's an idea rather than an actual in-practice thing. So what exactly do I want from frame generation, and how do I want to achieve that? Now, I'm just talking out of my mouth. I don't actually have a script or anything, so I'll talk out of my butt, essentially. So I don't have a script or anything, so sorry if this video is a bit of a miss. But essentially, again, I want the frame rate limits that I set to be the limit of the amount of frames in general that I have. Not just the limit of generated frames, not just the limit of real frames, but the actual limit of both mixed together. And what I want the frame generation tech to be, to take a look at is, let's say I set my frame rate limit to, I don't know, 120 again, let's go with that, right? And my frame rate is 100, like I said in the beginning. And now I'm missing 20 frames. I did this because 2 times 10. Anyway, I'm missing 20 frames. And all of a sudden, now I'm missing those 20 frames that I want, because now my limit is 120. So now it's 120. You can also just say that you can usually achieve 120 FPS normally, and then... But let's go with my example first, then I'll tell you about another example later on that could also be useful. But we go with the 120 is the limit, and 100 FPS is where I set the... Or what I actually get. Let's go with that. Of real frames. Not fake frames, real frames. And I turn on the upscaling, the frame generation. Not upscaling, what am I talking... Well, you can also use it with upscaling. Who knows? It's fine. Sorry, I'm just so used to their weird marketing that it's getting to me, It's working on me, it's bad. But then you go ahead and use frame generation to reach 120. Instead of it halving the FPS you have there, it just adds those extra 20 frames. That is what I want, and I'm guessing that's what most people want who want a safe frame rate. I don't want to play with 170 FPS where only half of them are real frames. That gives worse visuals and worse input lag. Even though at that point in time the input lag is not a big problem, but you still don't get as much of a response from your latency that you would have otherwise. Just a thing. All right, but then how do you benefit from that as a gamer, I guess? How do you benefit from getting those extra 20 frames? Let's say you want an even frame rate, or you want a specific frame rate that you're comfortable with, or something similar to that. Like, let's say you have 100 frames, you get 20 more, because that's what you're comfortable with, that is what you want. Then you now go ahead and get more frames, essentially. And you get those frames, they might look worse, they might look a little bit better, but they're inserted in between a couple frames in a way that makes it more seamless and it's not as distracting because there aren't a lot of them. They're just kind of there because you have 100 frames, so they needs to try to reach 120. And then, of course, you can set a limit on how many frames you're allowed to have and what you can do, but essentially, that's how I really wanted it to work. I really wanted frame generation to be a way of getting frames you otherwise couldn't get before. A way to get the amount of frame rate that you really feel comfortable playing with, right? Because it's always been a problem in gaming, where you get like a high frame rate, it escalates a lot. It goes up and down, which I'm going to talk about later in the other example for this exact same way I'm talking about this, so the exact same idea. So it always escalates and it goes up and down, and it always distracts from the gameplay. And sometimes there are heavy areas that lower your frame rate big time, and sometimes there are very easy areas that max out your frame rate quite high, and it keeps being inconsistent like that. So having a technology that evens it out and makes sure you always have a consistent frame rate, but the latency technically is the only thing that changes, and maybe the visuals depending on the actual thing you use. I think that is a great way of trying to manage that, and I think there would have been a better way to implement frame generation. Now, I don't know the technical details for just using one-to-one scaling, because that's what they're doing. Again, they're using the double FPS of what you set as a limit. So if your refresh rate, if your FPS is limited below your refresh rate, then it's half of your refresh rate that is technically the FPS limit minus 3 FPS or something like that. I still think they could have done it a better way, and it just kind of let the player set an FPS. They even did it with upscaling with the first FSR, I'm pretty sure, right? Yeah, I'm pretty sure, yeah, they did that. The first FSR they had, that AMD had, it had a scaling thing where you can lower the quality to get a specific amount of FPS. And I think that was a great way to implement that too. I don't know why they're not using it anymore. Maybe because it was inconsistent at the quality it was given, but it's a great idea. Like, it's a great idea to have an FPS you want to achieve, and then the upscaling automatically does the upscaling depending on what area you're in to get that FPS as close as possible. At least I think that's a great idea. Now, I could be overlooking something that is why it didn't work or why it didn't go properly, but I guess it was more inconsistent views based on more inconsistent graphics, I guess. Maybe that's why people didn't really like that much. But I used it when I played my Halo Infinite campaign, by the way, and I didn't really notice a big difference. I'm just going to be honest and say that. I did not really notice a big difference. Then again, my old PC could barely run that, so there's that, I suppose. So what is the other example that could be very useful for gamers? You know, I already spoke about how the FPS fluctuates up and down all the time. So let me talk about exactly how that can be a fix with frame generation. So let's say frame generation worked like I wanted, right? It inserted 20 frames to get the FPS you wanted. But now let's say you can reach 120 frames. You now have 120 frames. You now have also, you're stuck at 120 frames, right? And you see that you're playing a game where FPS fluctuates a lot. And now you're in a game that keeps pretty much also changing the latency. By the way, this also changes latency when your real frames also go down and up. Just so you're aware, it's not just frame generation that messes with latency. Actual real frames give you latency bonuses as well, or rather it lowers latency and goes back up again with the latency depending on your FPS. Okay, so let's say we use fake frames to fix essentially that problem, where games have a tendency to have heavy areas and light areas on the FPS. And now frame generation is used to stabilize your FPS essentially and make sure you always get 120 FPS all the time. No matter if you're in an area where you go down to 90 FPS or if you're in an area that goes up to, I don't know, 150 FPS. If you limit the FPS at a point where your PC can probably reach, even if it couldn't reach, by the way, that's also the point. Now you essentially have a thing that could assist and help you out by just making it so you don't notice a degradation in actual visual fidelity or visual smoothness in the game. Instead, you get a little bit of a debuff to latency, but it doesn't have the latency by removing frames. Now you can have a consistent experience with 120 FPS without having the big half FPS debuff because then it uses 60 FPS latency. Now it only uses 100 FPS latency, and then you reach the target that they set originally, which is higher FPS. Means you can use upscaling to get even higher FPS. Now it means now you can go to 80 FPS, and if you're comfortable with 90 FPS, then you can get 10 more FPS just by turning on frame generation, and then it scales, or it puts fake frames in between 10 of those. Well, it's technically 20, right? I don't really know how it works. It inserts a fake frame between 2 actual frames, so it essentially gives you more FPS that way too. And that way you still have a stable experience, you get exactly what you want. That is how I wanted frame generation to be. I wanted it to be an option, so if you as a gamer are used or want a specific FPS, it should be a way to get that FPS even with fake frames. And just because you like how smooth it looks, or something like that, of course there's still going to be the latency, but it's not going to be as bad because now you're not cutting your FPS in half and then taking the latency from that cut in half and then applying it to the next one because you like having a specific FPS. It's also useful for me as a person who records stuff to kind of limit the FPS to 20 or 180, but I don't have 180 Hz. My screen is 144. So I'm forced to have an inconsistent FPS 1-to-1, if you know what I mean. Like, because I record at 60 FPS, if I then record from 144 and scale down to 60, it's not going to be even, which means it's going to look a little bit more stuttery. Like, it's barely noticeable in videos, but it is noticeable. And because I'm a weird quality freak like that, I do prefer it to be controlled, like the FPS in games. And I don't think it's just me who's going to benefit from this. Like, the original thing with the Hardware Unboxed did a great take on this, by the way. But if you go ahead and you look at Hardware Unboxed's thing, they keep talking about how you need a high frame rate and pretty much essentially a higher refresh rate if you don't want to get rid of the frames, essentially with fast sync on NVIDIA's control panel. Then essentially you want a high frame rate and a high refresh rate of your screen to actually achieve a good experience with frame generation. And that's without talking about the visual issues with it. Sorry about that. So yeah, it's an interesting technology. It is beneficial if it can be used correctly, but the actual use for it right now is pretty limited. It doesn't really have that whole oh wow, it's so useful feel to it, because it's such a specific use case that it kind of makes no sense that it exists. I do think it's great for people who have like who's not recording, who doesn't like a specific FPS, who just want a very high FPS, no matter if it's inconsistent or not. I just feel like it would be more useful if you could ask it to give you a specific FPS at all times and put fake frames to achieve that FPS. That is the kind of technology that I wanted frame generation to be. Of course, like I said, it's just my view, my opinion. I wanted to make a different video this time around. A video trying to explain something I've been thinking about. Something I think could benefit gaming as a whole, and something I believe a lot of people could benefit from and use in their games to have a better experience, essentially. And again, I am saying this without knowing the limitations of frame generation and how it functions, but I keep seeing it being a selling point and a reason to get graphics cards and a reason to get a game, as an example. And the more I see that, the more I feel like it should be more than what it is, because essentially it's just there to make things look a little bit nicer. And if that was the case, then it's a lot like ray tracing. Like, it makes things look nicer at the cost of your experience, right? I believe it can be useful again for people with higher FPS and higher refresh rate screens, but for people like me who has 144 screens, which is the majority, by the way, unless you're playing 1080p, I don't know what you're playing on, but anyway. Even 4K users, 1440p users, all that stuff, it could be super useful if you could tell it to give you a specific frame rate. And I believe, again, that most people would benefit from that. I believe a lot of people would find a lot of enjoyment from that in their games. Benefit a lot. So I wish they would make this technology. I don't want them to use it as a selling, because corporations, right? NVIDIA and AMD, they're gonna find some way to either one, glorify themselves, or two, they're gonna go ahead and log it behind something, maybe a paywall or some other thing, instead of just being beneficial with it. Now, I'm not on anyone's side, by the way. AMD, NVIDIA, both of them are kind of corporate entities that think more about money than actual people. I don't mean to hate on any of them, and also don't like any of them. I'm just saying what I don't want them to do now. We just take this idea and essentially ruin it as something good and just kind of mess with it. I also don't know how much modders can mess with FSR 3 and how much they can mess with NVIDIA's thing. But if it's at all possible to mod FSR 3, I know that's open source right now, and change it in any way, shape, or form, and make it only scale to a specific FPS with the AI frames, then we could either, one, see why they can't make it work the way that you would think, right? Where you can put stuff between 2 frames only at certain points. Or we could just have it be a little bit special, I mean, for all I know, it will still have to delay the frames. But then again, why does it not delay the other half of the frames? If that's the case. Then it's put between 2 frames. I don't know, it could just be a useful technology. Whether it's technically delayed to be put between 2 frames. So, yeah. Anyway, those are my thoughts on frame generation as a whole. I do not, again, I need to stress, I don't know what the limitations are, but I'm guessing that the way they put frames into the game requires it to have all of the frames be spaced out evenly, and then put something in the middle of them in order for them to function in a smooth manner, right? So maybe that is the limitation, but then you could artificially kind of make it almost smoothen out too. I don't know. I don't know enough to really make a statement on whether or not this would work. But it's something that they could work towards. Something I would love to see them work towards. But yeah, this is certainly a different video for me, isn't it? I'm not really used to these videos where I just talk into a camera or rather my phone. I'm technically using my phone to record this. So yeah, I'm not really used to these things, but it's enjoyable to get some thoughts out now and again, even if they turn out to be nothing but air. And even if people don't watch them, it's still interesting to talk about and share. But I do think that could be the next step, hopefully, where frame generation is set to the amount that players want instead of just trying to achieve the highest FPS, but still fluctuates a lot depending on the normal FPS you get. Could be super useful. Could be very, very useful. Still wish that you didn't have to slow down the frames in order to put another frame in between. And of course, if you were to do that, that means some frames would be faster than others. I don't know. I mean, my idea seems like a good idea, but technicality-wise, is it possible? Maybe with some kind of whole new technology developed for it. Is it possible with current frame generation? I think they had different thoughts in mind when they made the current frame generation. I think they just wanted to make the frames look good. So, yeah, I know it's a specific use case, I guess, with the modern ones. But if they could somehow make the whole frame generation work by giving you just a couple extra frames without ruining the other ones, even if you have to insert it between a couple of the frames, that could be so useful. If it functioned on a one-to-one basis, then there's nothing to be done, I guess. Well, if it does not function on a one-to-one basis, or if it can't, I guess I should say, then there's no point in even saying a lot of this. But I still think it's a great idea for a future technology, maybe. maybe upscaling can be upgraded to go back to that kind of thing where you can set an FPS that you can go for. With either with a slider like AMD did with FSR1, or just like any game really can get. Like you can achieve your FPS in different methods. I just think this would have been the best way for frame generation to really work, by simply going, all right, players have 100 FPS, they want 120. You know what? Frame generation can then go ahead and create 20 FPS for you, without hurting the other frames in the process. But I guess it technically has to hurt the amount it gives, right? Doesn't that technically, is that not how it works? Well, perhaps it is. Sometimes it happens where you say you want something and then it's not possible because of the limitations of the technology. But just imagine though, just imagine how useful a technology like that would be. It would be super useful. It would be super nice. But yeah, I think that is all I can really say for this video. It was an interesting video to make. I do think it was it is just nice to get some thoughts out there, to talk about it. A great idea, at least I think it would be, to make a technology like this. Maybe not frame generation specifically, maybe another way to get fake frames without having to delay other frames would probably be the best approach. Otherwise, things might look a bit off. Technically, that makes no sense, because they delay the frames because then it smoothens out. So you just have to put fake frames in between real frames. Then we just boost the frames a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to make the technology work like this. It would be super nice as well. It really would be. So, yeah. I don't have much more to say. Could be a cool technology to get, cool technology to use, and how I think frame generation would have been better if they had tried to go for this goal instead. And let me know if you guys want more videos of just thoughts in general about optimizations of games, things you kind of want to see from me, and I don't know, if you want my thoughts on something specific, you can leave in the comment section. I'll make a video talking about it just randomly. And then I will go ahead and be, oh wow, that's crazy. Let's talk about this thing and why I disagree with it, why I agree with it, and what I think it could provide anyone in this situation. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Hope you check out other videos of mine, whether it's Let's Plays or some other weird stuff like my small videos or my big videos. I'm also starting to stream a little bit, but I don't know if that's really something I really want to do for the long term. I just kind of like to stream now and again. It's not something I always do. It's just random. Whenever I play a game for fun, I'm like, maybe I could stream this thing. But yes, hope you enjoyed. Hope to see another one of my videos. And as always, stay awesome.